The first thing I noticed was the smell. Burnt motor oil has a way of punching you in the nose, even before your brain figures out what it is. I'd just gotten back from an overnight shift at the hospital, dropped my bag by the kitchen counter, and walked out to the backyard to check the pool. It was supposed to be my day off, grill some burgers, maybe nap in the hammock, but instead, I was hit with a stench so thick it nearly knocked me over. My pool was black. Thick, glistening swirls of used oil floated across the surface, like an oil slick in the Gulf. I just stood there, jaw slack, heart pounding. It wasn't a leak. It was deliberate. Someone had dumped oil gallons of it into my pool. I didn't have to wonder who did it. I already knew. Karen Kingsley, president of the Cedar Pines Homeowners Association. 50-something, bleach blonde, always in a pastel cardigan and oversized sunglasses. Her whole personality revolved around three things: her title, her clipboard, and making sure everyone else in the neighborhood suffered, so she could feel important. Karen had been on my case ever since I moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago. First, it was my driveway being too industrial because I had a work van. Then it was my grass being a 1/4 inch too long. She fined me for hanging a flag on my porch because it wasn't HOA approved. I appealed. She doubled the fine. But this was a whole new level. I stormed to the side gate and peeked through the slats of the privacy fence. Her backyard was diagonal from mine. And there she was standing with her arms crossed, watching my pool like she was waiting for a reaction. When she saw me looking, she smiled. Not the friendly kind. The smug kind. Then she walked inside like it was just another Tuesday. I took photos. Lots of photos. Then I called the non-emergency police line, followed by the county environmental department. I wasn't about to clean this up on my own. I'm an ER nurse, not a toxic waste handler. By the time the hazmat crew arrived, half the street was rubbernecking. Guys in white suits and respirators started scooping sludge out of my pool while a county inspector took notes and interviewed me in the driveway. "You're sure it was oil?" he asked. "Smell it for yourself," I said, pointing to the black sheen still glistening on the water. "And I've got security cams." That got his attention. I pulled up the footage on my phone. My backyard camera caught everything. At 2:30 in the morning, Karen had walked through the gate. Yes, she had a key, courtesy of a shady clause in the HOA charter that allowed property inspections, dragging 2 5-gallon containers. She knelt by the deep end, unscrewed the caps, and poured both barrels of used motor oil into my pool. Then she strutted back out like she'd just mowed my lawn as a favor. The inspector blinked. "That's felony dumping, especially with that volume." I nodded. "And it's all on record." Karen had no idea who she messed with. I don't just work in the ER. I used to be a hazmat responder before switching to nursing. I knew the protocols. I knew who to call. And most importantly, I knew exactly how much this cleanup was going to cost. Karen thought I'd roll over and take it, that I'd be too scared to fight the HOA. She didn't realize I had receipts. Literally. By that evening, the cleanup crew had drained my pool, removed the contaminated water, and decontaminated the surrounding concrete. They left me with a full invoice, $12,684. And I sent it straight to the HOA. Not just a casual email. I filed an official damage claim with the HOA's insurance provider, attaching the police report, the environmental citation, and the video footage of Karen dumping the oil. I CC'd the HOA board and copied my attorney for good measure. Karen tried to deny it, of course she did. 2 days later, I got a letter taped to my front door. Not mailed. Taped. Real professional. "Dear Mr. Byron Hasker," it began in Comic Sans of all things. "Your accusations are unfounded and defamatory. The HOA is not responsible for personal property maintenance or damage. You are hereby fined for slander, property neglect, and unapproved hazmat activity. Fine total, $1,600. Payable within 10 days. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. She thought she could find me for reporting a crime? I walked straight over to her house. Knocked once. Karen opened the door wearing a silk bathrobe and a face full of smugness. "You got my letter," she said. "I did," I replied. "And you're going to want to talk to your insurance provider, because you're about to be personally liable for over 12 grand. Plus whatever the county fines you for illegal hazardous waste dumping." Her smile faltered. "Excuse me? I have you on video pouring oil into my pool. I've already submitted everything to the county, the HOA's insurance, and the local news station. Might want to tune in tonight." "You're lying." I tapped my phone. The video played again her, in the dead of night, dumping the oil. Karen's face went pale. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," she hissed. "Good," I said. "Mine's already drafting the civil suit." I turned and walked away. By nightfall, the story aired on the local news. HOA president caught dumping oil in resident's pool. They blurred her face, but everyone in the neighborhood knew who it was. Her pastel cardigans weren't exactly subtle. The next HOA meeting was packed. Residents who hadn't shown up in years came just to see what would happen. Karen tried to control the meeting like usual, banging her little gavel and telling people to stay on topic. But the topic was her. "Why is our HOA president committing environmental crimes?" someone shouted. Karen tried to spin it, claimed the video was doctored, that I was retaliating for being fined. But then the county inspector walked in, uninvited. He'd heard the story on the news and brought copies of the environmental violation notice. Karen's head snapped toward the board. "You can't let him speak." The rest of the board looked like they wanted to crawl under the table. "Actually," said one of the residents behind me, "we can. He's a government official. And this meeting is public." The inspector walked to the front and laid out the facts: illegal dumping, environmental hazard, and pending charges. Karen stood there like a statue, eyes wide, mouth twitching. I just sat back, arms crossed, letting it all unfold. And this was just the beginning. The morning after the HOA meeting, I woke up to a banging noise, not from construction or landscapers, but from my front door. I opened it to find a deputy sheriff standing on the porch, clipboard in hand, cruiser humming at the curb. "You Byron Hasker?" I nodded, wiping sleep from my eyes. "Yeah. What's this about?" He handed me a manila folder. "Summons. Civil harassment complaint. Filed by Karen Kingsley." I scanned the paperwork. She was accusing me of creating a hostile environment, public defamation, and my favorite, intentional emotional distress. "She dumped used oil in my pool," I said, holding the folder like it was dipped in nonsense. The deputy shrugged, clearly not thrilled to be the messenger. "Not saying it makes sense. Just delivering it." I thanked him, closed the door, and immediately called my attorney, Erica Tanaka. She'd been representing hospital staff in liability cases for years and had a personal vendetta against overreaching HOAs after her own run-in with one in Westfield Heights. "Typical HOA retaliation," she said after a quick review. "This isn't about distress. It's about optics. She's trying to muddy the waters before the criminal charges stick." "Pun intended?" I asked. "Always," Erica said. "Don't worry. We'll file a motion to strike. And I've already drafted our civil suit against both her and the HOA board as co-defendants." "Wait, the board too?" Erica's voice sharpened. "They allowed her unrestricted access to your property under a clause that's wildly overbroad. Their failure to supervise her constitutes negligence. We're going after the HOA's general liability policy and her personal homeowner's insurance." That afternoon, I installed a second set of cameras, this time pointed toward the front and side of the house. Not because I was paranoid, but because I'd seen what cornered people like Karen were capable of. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was exposed. And people like her didn't go down quietly. Sure enough, the next day, 3 new, compliance violations showed up in my mailbox. One cited me for unauthorized exterior surveillance equipment. Another claimed I had visibly cracked concrete on the walkway. The third fined me for excessive noise from industrial cleanup machinery. All dated retroactively. All signed by Karen. I walked them straight to the trash. At sunset, I took a stroll down Ashwood Lane. Neighbors were in their driveways, washing cars, walking dogs, watering flower beds. For the first time since I moved in, people stopped to talk. Not the usual tight-lipped nods, but actual conversation. "You really got her on tape?" asked Mr. Alvarez, a retired fire chief who lived 2 doors down. "Yup. County's got the footage now." He chuckled and shook his head. About time someone stood up to her. "You know, she tried to fine me for putting up solar panels. Said they weren't aesthetically consistent. I had to get a state permit to shut her up. Turns out I wasn't the only one she'd harassed. A young couple across the street told me how she'd sent them a cease and desist for hanging string lights on their patio. Another neighbor described being fined weekly for improper mailbox alignment. "She has a ruler," the woman whispered. "A ruler. She measures mailboxes." The stories kept coming. And they weren't just petty fines. Some were financial threats. Others were blatant intimidation. One man, Kyle, a mechanic, said she'd reported his home business to the county 3 times, all false accusations. "We should do something," he said. "Like, all of us." That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about my pool anymore. It was about years of unchecked control, quietly tolerated because no one wanted to deal with the paperwork or the drama. But now she'd gone too far, and people were paying attention. The next day, I filed a public records request with the county clerk's office. I wanted every HOA fine, lien, and complaint filed under cedar pines from the last 8 years. It took them 3 days to process. What I got back filled 2 boxes. It was a paper trail of overreach fines that escalated without notice, liens placed without due process, and signatures that didn't match board members' actual names. One document showed Karen signing as both president and treasurer, a violation of the HOA's own bylaws. Another file caught my eye, a lien placed on a veteran's home for refusing to repaint shutters. The man had died 2 months later. The HOA had foreclosed on his house less than a year after his passing. I called Erica. "We've got enough here to file for injunctive relief," she said after reviewing the documents. "And maybe a class action if other residents join. But first, we get the county prosecutor involved." She made a few calls. By the end of the week, an investigator from the district attorney's office reached out. They'd received multiple complaints since the news story aired, and were now looking into potential misuse of HOA funds, unlawful property entry, and fraudulent liens. They asked for my footage. I gave them everything. 2 nights later, Karen's porch was lit up by red and blue lights. A county investigator and 2 uniformed deputies stood at her door. I watched from my kitchen window as she opened it, stepped outside in a blazer and slippers, and was handed a subpoena. The next morning, her lawn sign, the one that said, "HOA President Maintaining Excellence," was gone. The board called an emergency meeting the following week. This time, it wasn't held in the clubhouse but in the gymnasium of a nearby elementary school to accommodate the crowd. Erica came with me, dressed in a charcoal pantsuit and holding a thick binder. Residents packed the bleachers. The board sat at a folding table near the stage, visibly uncomfortable. Karen wasn't there. One of the board members, a wiry man named Greg, stood up and cleared his throat. "In light of recent developments," he began, "Karen Kingsley has taken a voluntary leave of absence pending the outcome of the county's investigation." The room erupted. People shouted questions. Greg held up his hands. "We understand the community has concerns. Starting today, the board will no longer enforce fines issued without photographic evidence and timestamp verification. A subcommittee will be formed to review all previous violations issued under Ms. Kingsley's tenure. Erica leaned toward me. That's the sound of panic control. When the floor opened for public comment, I walked to the mic. My name is Byron Hasker. I moved here 6 months ago. I've filed a civil claim against the HOA for negligence and am cooperating with the district attorney's office. But this isn't about one person. It's about a system that let one person act unchecked. We need clarity, transparency, and actual accountability. A few people clapped, then more, until the whole room was on its feet. Back at home, I found a new letter in my mailbox. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was handwritten, folded neatly, taped shut. I opened it. It was from a neighbor I hadn't met, a single mother named Denise. She thanked me for standing up to the board and shared how she'd been too afraid to speak up after being fined for having a basketball hoop in her driveway. Her son had taken it down in tears. I couldn't afford to move, she wrote. But I didn't feel like I lived here anymore. You changed that. I sat on my porch for a long time after that. Not out of exhaustion, but something closer to relief. For the first time since moving in, the neighborhood felt like mine too. Karen thought pouring oil in my pool would make me submit. Instead, it made me dig in. And I wasn't the only one. The first court date was set for a Tuesday morning. I showed up early, dressed in a navy jacket and black slacks, hair combed back with the kind of precision I usually reserved for trauma shifts. Erica met me on the courthouse steps, binder in hand, her expression unreadable behind dark-rimmed glasses. She told me to expect delays, procedural nonsense, maybe even a continuance if Karen's new attorney tried to stall. What I didn't expect was the crowd. At least 24 Cedar Pines residents had shown up. Some wore polo shirts and khakis, others jeans and windbreakers. Mr. Alvarez gave me a nod as I passed. Denise was there too, hands folded tightly in her lap, her teenage son beside her. A few brought coffee. No one smiled. Karen arrived 10 minutes late, heels clicking too loudly on the old tile floor. She wore a slate gray pantsuit and carried a leather folder under one arm like she was there to file paperwork, not face a civil suit and a pending criminal referral. Her attorney, a man with slicked back hair and a pinstripe suit that looked like it had never seen a courtroom, whispered something to her as they passed. She didn't look at anyone in the gallery. The judge was a middle-aged woman with a sharp jawline and a habit of tapping her pen against the bench. She wasted no time. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice echoing across the room. "This is a preliminary hearing regarding a civil complaint for property damage and emotional distress, as well as an attached petition for injunctive relief. We are not here to debate HOA policy. We are here to determine whether this matter proceeds to trial." Karen's lawyer tried to argue for dismissal. He cited lack of intent, community authority, and a string of HOA bylaws that supposedly granted Karen access to private property for inspections. Erica waited for him to finish, then stood with measured calm. "Your Honor, my client has provided timestamped security footage showing the defendant entering his property without notice at night, carrying hazardous materials. There was no emergency, no consent, and no documentation of this so-called inspection. Additionally, the environmental damage was severe enough to trigger county intervention. We also have evidence that the HOA's own bylaws were altered without a member vote, a violation of California Civil Code Section 70-200. The judge raised an eyebrow. "I'll allow the complaint to proceed," she said. "And the motion for injunctive relief is granted. Effective immediately, the defendant is barred from entering the plaintiff's property or issuing any formal or informal fines or citations against him for the duration of this case." I didn't even try to hide my relief. The pressure in my chest loosened just a bit. As we stepped outside, the reporter from the local station caught up with me. She'd covered the original story, and now she had a cameraman in tow. "How do you feel about the court's decision today?" she asked. "I feel like the system's finally catching up," I said. "And this isn't just about me. It's about how these organizations can abuse power when no one's watching." That night, I got a call from the county investigator. He sounded different, more urgent. "We've expanded the inquiry," he said. Turns out this wasn't the first time hazardous materials were involved. A former board member came forward, someone Karen forced out last year. He claims she ordered the disposal of paint thinners, pesticides, and other banned substances in common areas to avoid paying for proper disposal. We're talking multiple violations, potentially criminal. I sat forward, gripping the phone tight. "Is this going public?" "Soon," he said. "But first, we're coordinating with the Environmental Crimes Task Force. If this checks out, we're looking at felony charges, and not just for her." The next day, Erica and I met with 2 DA investigators in a small office behind the main courthouse. They laid out what they'd found so far: altered HOA meeting minutes, forged signatures on budget approvals, and a paper trail that showed Karen had diverted nearly $20,000 from the reserve fund to pay for private landscaping around her property camouflaged as vegetation control. Even worse, they said the HOA's contracted waste hauler had been fired 2 years prior. In its place, Karen had hired a local handyman with no license or disposal permits. He'd been dumping chemicals behind the retention wall near the east end of the neighborhood. That retention wall drained directly into a protected creek. The investigators asked if I'd be willing to testify, not just about the pool incident, but about the broader pattern of misconduct. I didn't hesitate. 2 days later, the county posted a formal notice at the Cedar Pines clubhouse. It declared a temporary suspension of all HOA operations pending investigation. The board was dissolved under emergency authority, and a court-appointed trustee was assigned to manage the community's affairs. It was unprecedented. News vans returned, this time with bigger cameras and satellite dishes. The word embezzlement started floating around. So did environmental felony. Karen tried to play the victim. She stood on her porch one afternoon giving a statement to a reporter, claiming she was being scapegoated by disgruntled residents and that she never intended to cause harm. But the damage was done. Photos of the contaminated dumping site surfaced. Aerial drone footage showed the discolored runoff bleeding into the creek. The Environmental Task Force had launched a full-scale cleanup and tested downstream for toxins. The county was already talking about lawsuits for ecological damage. Then came the arrest. It wasn't dramatic. No cuffs on the lawn, no shouting. She turned herself in, flanked by 2 attorneys, ducking beneath a jacket to avoid the cameras. But the mugshot hit the news within hours. Her bond was set high, over $200,000, and word spread fast. I got a call from Kyle, the mechanic who Karen had harassed over zoning complaints. "She ever try to get you to sign one of those blank violation forms?" he asked. "No." "Why? What are you thinking?" "I found a stack of them in a file labeled pending infractions. None of them were filled out. Just signatures. Mostly hers." Erica took one look and flagged it as potential forgery. The DA subpoenaed the entire HOA office records. A week later, a forensic audit confirmed over 30 falsified citations, all used to justify liens or threats of foreclosure. The community was stunned. But something else happened, too. Without the board in place, people started organizing on their own. Kyle and Denise set up a neighborhood watch, not for crime, but for property issues, helping elderly residents fix broken fences or mow overgrown lawns before they became real problems. Mr. Alvarez offered to lead a compliance committee focused on education, not punishment. A local realtor stepped in to help residents challenge unfair liens. With Erica's help, they filed a class action to reverse every penalty issued during Karen's time in office. As for me, I finally got my pool refinished. The company gave me a discount after hearing the story. Blue tile, new filtration system, no trace of the oil. I grilled burgers that weekend and invited the whole block over. People came, even ones I hadn't met yet. They brought lemonade, folding chairs, potato salad. Kids jumped in the pool while the adults talked about bylaws, voting rights, and how they'd never again let someone like Karen run unchecked. Under the glow of string lights, Denise raised a toast. "To accountability," she said. And this time, the whole neighborhood cheered. 3 months after Karen's arrest, Cedar Pines looked like a different neighborhood. The rows of beige and taupe houses still stood in their tidy symmetry, but the tension that once clung to the sidewalks like humidity had lifted. People greeted each other without the hesitant glances. Garden flags reappeared. Porch swings creaked again. Someone even painted their front door turquoise. But beneath the surface, a legal storm was still brewing. The civil case Erica had filed on my behalf was now in full swing. Depositions had begun, and the discovery phase had unearthed a staggering amount of documentation, emails, handwritten notes, drafts of fake fines that never got issued. Karen's personal laptop had been seized under warrant after investigators learned she'd been using it to maintain a parallel HOA ledger, one that tracked non-compliant residents and predicted who would be vulnerable to pressure. Erica didn't tell me everything. She didn't need to. But I could read her expressions well enough during our prep sessions to know that what they'd found was worse than either of us had imagined. We met in her office one Thursday afternoon. She sat at her desk, flipping through a thick binder with colored tabs sticking out like feathers. I leaned on the armrest of the visitor chair, watching her face as she read silently. She didn't just falsify citations, Erica said without looking up. She created fictitious complaints and then resolved them in board minutes to justify spending. Landscaping, pest control, even legal fees. I shook my head slowly. So, she billed the HOA for fixing problems that didn't exist? Not just billed, Erica replied. She contracted her cousin's company to perform the work, then funneled the payments through a shell account. The cousin's business doesn't even have a valid license. It's all in here. She flipped to a page and turned the binder toward me. There was a printout of a wire transfer log, followed by a screenshot of a LinkedIn profile. Gregory Kingsley, Property Solutions Consultant. She moved nearly $70,000 over 4 years, all disguised as routine maintenance. Is that enough for criminal charges? Erica closed the binder with a quiet finality. It already is. But the DA's office is building a racketeering case. They're not just going after her. They're looking at anyone who signed off on these payments. At least 2 former board members are cooperating. My stomach tightened. How far does this go? She looked up finally, eyes steady. Farther than we thought. That evening, I met Kyle and Denise at the community center, the same building that used to host the dreaded HOA meetings. Now, it was a planning hub. A volunteer group had formed, calling itself the Cedar Pines Council. They weren't trying to replace the HOA, just redesign it from the ground up. With a court-appointed trustee still managing day-to-day affairs, residents had taken the opportunity to rethink everything. We need transparency, Kyle said, pacing in front of a dry erase board. No more closed-door fines, no more surprise citations. If someone's lawn needs cutting, we knock on the door. We don't send a bill. Denise nodded. And no more contracts without community approval. I want to know who's trimming trees and why it costs $5,000. I added one more point. And any board member caught altering documents? Immediate removal. No appeals. We don't let another Karen happen. That night, we finalized a draft for a proposed charter, a complete overhaul of the HOA bylaws, with checks, term limits, and mandatory public reporting. It would be submitted to the court-appointed trustee the following week for review. But the fallout wasn't over yet. 3 days later, I was called to testify before the grand jury. It wasn't like the court hearings, no robes, no lawyers speaking for me. Just a panel of 12 citizens and a county prosecutor asking questions. The room felt heavier than any I'd ever worked in. I answered everything truthfully. How I discovered the oil, how I traced it to Karen, how she used her position not just to harass, but to manipulate an entire community into silence. I explained the cleanup, the costs, the aftermath. When I left the building, the prosecutor followed me into the hallway. "You did the right thing," she said. "Most people just pay the fines and move on. You documented everything." I nodded, unsure what else to say. Weeks passed. Subpoenas rolled out. More residents came forward. A woman named Clara, who'd lived on the far side of the neighborhood, revealed that she'd been threatened with foreclosure after appealing a fine for a cracked bird bath. Another man disclosed that his mother had sold her house under pressure after Karen accused her of violating aesthetic uniformity by planting wildflowers. The stories kept coming. And then came the indictment. Karen was charged with 22 counts: fraud, criminal misappropriation of funds, unlawful entry, environmental endangerment, and conspiracy to defraud homeowners. Her cousin Gregory was also indicted. So were two former board members who knowingly signed off on fake invoices in exchange for kickbacks, gift cards, home repairs, even a cruise voucher. The trial was scheduled for early spring. In the meantime, I returned to my job at the hospital in a more regular capacity. For the first time since moving into Cedar Pines, I came home without wondering what citation might be taped to my door. The cameras stayed up, but more out of habit than necessity. People waved when I drove by. Someone left fresh baked muffins on my doorstep with a note that just read, "For standing up." Then, one cool morning in February, I received a letter from the trustee's office. It was stamped with the county seal and folded neatly inside a plain envelope. Inside was a check. $12,684. Full reimbursement for the pool cleanup. Accompanying the check was a formal apology letter, signed by the interim trustee and reviewed by the Board of Supervisors. It acknowledged the HOA's failure in safeguarding resident property and admitted that the previous leadership had acted outside the bounds of reasonable authority. I took the check straight to the bank. Later that week, the neighborhood held a vote. With over 70% turnout, the new charter passed. The HOA would be dissolved and replaced by a resident council. No paid board. Every decision would be voted on. All finances would be public record. At the final community meeting before the transition, I stood in the back near the coffee table, watching people mingle and talk without fear. Kyle was explaining the new landscaping rotation. Denise was organizing a spring cleanup day. Even Mr. Alvarez had volunteered to teach a CPR class in the clubhouse. I didn't speak that night. I didn't need to. The neighborhood had found its voice. And the next time I stepped into my backyard, the pool water shimmered clean and clear. The smell of motor oil was long gone. In its place was the scent of fresh grass, barbecue smoke drifting from a neighbor's grill, and the sound of kids laughing across the fence. Justice didn't come all at once. It didn't knock loudly or announce itself in headlines. It came in pieces in courtrooms, in conversations, in the quiet rewriting of rules by the very people who had been ignored for too long. Karen thought pouring oil in my pool would make me disappear. Instead, it made the whole neighborhood wake up.